We have the pleasure of having Joshua Goodman from Boston University, who's going to present his paper on bullying and cyberbullying. Josh got his master's degree from Cambridge University and then a PhD in economics from Columbia. And now he's associate professor of economics and education in Boston. And his current research is in, well, labor economics, economics of education, and more in general, like applied microeconomics. So please, Josh, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me. Let me make sure that I can share my screen. Oh, hold on, give me 1 second to figure this out. Okay, let's get this. Can you see that okay? Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much to all of you for coming. As I was saying to Bernardo before, I would be very happy for people to unmute themselves and interrupt with questions. It actually makes it more interesting for me as we go along, and it lets me, keep track of whether you're actually engaged. So please feel free to interrupt. Whether you can unmute yourself, you can do the hand raise function. If you want to put something in the chat, that's fine. I can't see the chat itself, so Bernardo, if people are putting stuff in the chat and want to ask questions, maybe if you could just call on them.
I always keep an eye on the chat, so just focus on the presentation, and I will let you know if anything comes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm presenting today this paper on the pandemic's effect on school bullying and cyberbullying, and I'm becoming a big fan of the sort of short paper format in economics, which is becoming more popular in a variety of economics journals. And one of the things I particularly appreciate in the short paper format is that it's sometimes better to write a title that just tells people what the answer is rather than force them to actually read the whole paper. And so the paper is about the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to show you, we think, pretty strong evidence that it disrupted school bullying and cyberbullying. And actually, just a few days ago, we got the exciting news that this paper was conditionally accepted at AER Insights, which actually, I'll be totally frank, was a little bit of a surprise to us. I think it's a great paper in many ways. And as we go through, we can think about, I can sort of show you the parts of the paper that I think maybe intrigue the editor and the reviewers. So this is joint work with a junior faculty colleague of mine, Andrew Bacher-Hicks, who joined BU with me last year when I moved there. He is also a sort of an economist by training. Jennifer Green and Melissa Holt are two of my new colleagues here at the School of Education. They are not economists, but they specialize in child mental health and school bullying itself. And so Andrew and I were sort of in charge of the statistical parts of this, and Jennifer and Melissa were the ones sort of who actually know something about the subject matter itself and why our results are not totally crazy. So without further ado, let me get started. As I said, please don't be shy, interrupt, raise your hand, just unmute yourself. It's a small crowd. And I was before I did my PhD, I was a high school math teacher. So you are a much easier crowd to deal with than 30, 16-year-olds who I'm trying to teach pre-calculus to. Okay. So let's get into it. So the motivation for the paper is that in the US, the COVID-19 dramatically disrupted the usual functioning of schools. I apologize that I don't know exactly how this played out in Russia, but in the US, what happened in the spring of 2020, basically starting in March, is that all US schools shut down in-person learning and remained shut down for the entire spring semester, basically from March all the way through June when schools would normally end. Summertime then happened. In fall of 2020, even as in parts of the country, the pandemic had started to wane, a lot of schools remained remote. There were actually pretty big differences between parts of the US in sort of whether schools were reopening or not. At this point, right now, basically all schools are offering in-person options, but there's also a lot of still sort of chaos as the Delta variant is raging in the various places. And so things are still not back to normal yet. Most of the focus on COVID in schools has been heavily focused on the obvious negative consequences of the pandemic on kids' educational outcomes. Could be learning loss, lost learning time. It could be changes, the kids who just aren't showing up to school at all because life has been disrupted so much. There's been work on child mental health, on labor market outcomes, particularly for women who now bear the burden of the extra childcare they're doing when schools go remote. But this research was inspired in part by the fact that once in a while I would read stories in the newspaper about students for whom the dramatic change in schooling format actually improved some of their educational experience. And they were almost always seemed to be outliers. It's not that I want to imply that the pandemic was a great thing for kids overall, but we see hints that there are certain kinds of students for whom the remote model actually worked better than the in-person model. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to argue that the move to remote schooling has lowered rates of school bullying as well as cyberbullying. And I'm going to talk about them. These are particularly toxic behaviors that, as far as we can tell, do pretty serious damage to the victims of such behavior. And so let me just start by giving you a little bit of background about bullying and cyberbullying. I actually didn't know a lot about this topic when we got started on this, but at least in the US, both school-based in-person bullying as well as online cyberbullying have been the focus of a lot of policy and legislative energy, in part because they are really common behaviors in schools, and as far as we can tell, have substantial impacts on the health and mental health of the victims of bullying, as well as arguably the perpetrators. And so just to give you a little bit of statistics to show you about the prevalence, the best survey evidence we have suggests that among US high school students, about 20% of them report having been seriously bullied at some point in the past year at school, and 16% report having been bullied in the past year through the online format. There's all sorts of descriptive evidence out there that youth involved in bullying, both victims and perpetrators actually, report more suicidal ideation, meaning more thinking about committing suicide, more depression, more anxiety. Childhood bullying is linked to all kinds of negative physical, mental, economic outcomes in adulthood. The causal pathways there are sort of hard to pin down by some of the standards that economists like to use, but I think it's not a huge leap to sort of say that bullying almost certainly is extraordinarily damaging to the people involved, the victims of it. So it's a very common behavior, very costly, doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, certainly in the economics literature, at least, although in the education literature it does. And just to give you a concrete sense from the best survey evidence we have, the Center for Disease Control in the US runs a youth risky behavior survey. And when we take data from the most recent waves of that and just do some really basic descriptive work, it suggests that compared to otherwise observationally similar peers, students who report being bullied are substantially more likely to report feeling sad or hopeless, about 22 percentage points more likely to consider suicide, and about 12 percentage points more likely to commit or attempt suicide. And so, again, I don't want to make the claim that this is all causal. There's a lot of stuff that's a bit hard to control for here, but the magnitude of these relationships is really striking and enough to make us worried and really think it is worth energy sort of studying this phenomenon. Why study this in the context of the pandemic? What was interesting in the spring of 2020, at least in the US, is that as COVID forced all schools to shift to remote learning, there were a lot of voices in the US saying, basically expressing concern that as students were now spending much more time online, that there was going to be much more cyberbullying going on. And in fact, pre-pandemic research suggested that the more a kid used the internet, the more kids use the internet, the more you see reports of cyberbullying. So it was not a crazy concern. You saw it a lot in various media outlets. There were sort of acknowledgement that in-person bullying might decline, but there were concerns that it would be more than compensated for by the sort of online version of these things. And yet, given all this, there's actually relatively little good evidence one way or another about these phenomena during the pandemic, in part because it's really hard to track these behaviors normally. And whatever methods you use to track these behaviors normally during the pandemic, all those things fell apart. Kids were not being seen by their teachers, they weren't taking surveys, there was just no way to sort of measure anything going on with students directly. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to draw on prior analysis. We've written a prior paper along with Christine Mulhern, who's now at the Rand Corporation. We wrote a prior paper that said that it turns out that you can use internet search data to provide valuable information about educational choices people were making during COVID. So that was a paper about how COVID was, when schools were shutting down, COVID was driving some families to look for online learning resources to make up for the lost learning time that students were experiencing. And our point in that paper was that this internet search data is particularly valuable for measuring things that are usually hard to observe in typical data sets, or that are important to measure in real time. And that's often also quite hard to do with the kind of sort of surveys that we do that take a long time to compile. So bullying is something that's particularly hard to observe, even more so in real time. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to combine data from Google Trends, which I'll describe in more detail, but think of this as internet search data, with data on historical bullying rates that we have from other surveys in the US. And we're going to use that in combination to make 3 points. The first is that online search for bullying related terms are going to be a good proxy for actual bullying behavior. In other words, we're going to start by trying to make the case that the data, the internet search data itself, has meaningful information in it, pre-COVID, I should say. And then we're going to make the point that COVID dramatically lowered bullying and cyberbullying rates. Again, as long as if you believe that these internet searches are a good proxy for those behaviors. And then the third point we're going to make is that we think we have pretty decent evidence that it was in particular the move to remote schooling itself that was responsible for lowering bullying and cyberbullying rates, and not necessarily just the pandemic more broadly. That remote schooling itself is going to be an important mechanism here to explain this pattern. So let me pause here for a second, because I've sort of set up the basic topic and the sort of claims about what we're going to do and what we're going to show. Let me pause and see if there are clarifying questions or questions before I get into the heart of the analysis and the data.
It seems that everything is clear so far.
All right, but really don't be shy about unmuting yourself or raising your hand, or throwing something.
I won't, don't worry.
Okay, good. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the data that we're bringing to bear on this issue. So you right now can go on your computer to Google Trends. It's Trends, at least here it's trends.google.com. It might be a slightly different URL where you are. And what it does is it makes, actually, I've written something slightly wrong here, but it makes public measures of internet search behavior at various geographical levels. So you can get it, I've shown you a graph here for the United States. In the US, you can actually drill deeper down into individual states within the US, but you can do it for other countries as well. You can switch that region to Russia, you can switch it to Chile, you can switch it to anywhere else, and put in whatever search term you want to sort of explore the extent to which people are searching for in that geographic region. And what Google will spit back to you is a measure of what it calls search intensity. It's not going to tell you the number of searches that people have done for a phrase with that term in it. Instead, they're going to tell you what fraction of Google searches were devoted to that term. Okay. And even further complicating the issue, they're not going to actually tell you, 3% of searches were related to bullying. They're going to scale it on a 0 to 100 scale, which is totally arbitrary, except that 100 is the largest such search intensity in whatever the time period and geography you're exploring is. So in other words, you can get back a bunch of information that tells you sort of over time within a region how search intensity has been changing. And then you have to do a little bit of work to make it comparable across regions in your data set. And I'm happy to talk about the details of that. So it's not the most user-friendly data set at first, but a fairly small number of little tweaks can get it to the point where you can make meaningful inference. Again, not about the absolute amount of search going on or even the actual fraction of searches devoted to this term, but what you can do is talk about things like percent changes over time in the intensity of search for a given topic. And so we're going to use the logarithms of this outcome just so we can easily talk about percent changes. But that's going to be the idea, is we're going to talk about the extent to which search intensity for a given topic like bullying or cyberbullying might have, for example, doubled over some particular time period. And I'll point out that if you look in the graph I've shown you, I've just shown you a screenshot of what happens when you just go, nothing fancy, haven't even downloaded the data. This is just an image of what you'd see if you looked on Google Trends in the US for the the 1 year before and after the pandemic began and shut down schools. And what you can see is in the early part of that period that starts in 2019, you see a lot of, you see search for bullying, it's going up, it's going down. And then that precipitous decline hits right when schools all close, and it basically flattens out to its nearly lowest level in this time period, and it remains pretty flat for the rest of it. So I'm just showing you the kind of pictures you will get if you go to Google Trends. One challenge, I apologize, I tried to actually do this for Russia itself with the Russian term for bullying. At least what I saw in Google Trends was that the search intensity is low enough for that particular term that it often returns a bunch of sort of zeros or things that don't feel very informative. And so again, you may have to play with the data in order to get it to sort of spit out something that feels usable, and that may differ from region to region and time period to time period. So in the US, this works pretty well. I know that folks in other countries have started to use this approach, whether with bullying or other education related things. So I'd be curious to see if you tried this in Russia or in Chile or any of other countries you're interested in, whether you might be able to get something like this to work. But this is what it looks like in the US.
Josh.
Yes.
I think the problem with that is that Russian school children don't think bullying is something like an event. They think it's the normal life. They don't have a word to characterize that as something bad that's going on that needs to be dealt with. It's a reality that we have to, as scientists, we have to deal with that. Right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. That this is what people are searching for is clearly a social. The social context is really important here. And just to be clear, when you look at Google Trends, Google is just telling you what terms are being searched for by anyone. One disadvantage there are many disadvantages of the data. I mean, I think it's great data in some ways. We can't tell who is doing the searching. So we don't know if this is the children, the parents, the teachers, someone else. And so, but I take the point that if bullying itself is not seen as a major issue, then people won't be searching for it because they're not going to be looking for,
I don't think it's so much as an issue. It's rather than people don't know that it's a thing and they don't have a name for the thing. If you read like news materials about that, it's half of the time it's English spelling and half of the times it's the English word in Russian, like Cyrillic alphabet. So you don't get a Russian word for that because, well, it's hard to convince a lot of people that it's actually something to worry about. Like we lived like that in our high school, so like why do we care? But my point is, it's not because you did something wrong when you were looking for a Russian word. It's just you were doomed to failure because Russians don't care about it.
Well, I appreciate you making me feel a little better about myself, although this makes me maybe feel worse for Russian.
Well, also, I don't know if it's related to Sergei's point. I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt you, Victoria, but also I asked more than one person about the Russian term for bullying, and I got like different words, which I guess also come to Sergei's point.
Interesting. Yeah, so there's no widespread agreement. I will say, by the way, and then Victoria, I wanted to hear from you. I just want to say you can ask Google Trends to, you can search for multiple words and you can actually search for the sum of multiple words. So like if one term doesn't return enough searches, you can sort of say, well, give me that term plus two other terms and sort of get it to spit back the sum total of that. Which
basically, I send you the one that got like the highest number of answers, but there was.
I tried using that one and it didn't work.
Between people and within people also.
That's great. Victoria?
Well, thank you, Joshua. And my question is, how did you divide bullying at school, bullying at working places? How did you do that?
Great question. We didn't. You can't do that with this data. You can only say things like, are people searching for phrases with the word bullying in it? Now we could have added the word school to the search, but what turns out what will happen is that you get almost nothing back because when students and parents are searching for it, they don't actually use the whole phrase school bullying, they just call it bullying. And so it's absolutely true that some of this search that we're getting back or some of these results might be from non-school settings like work. I'm going to show you some evidence, I think, that suggests that at least a good chunk of this is almost certainly school related, but that is a disadvantage of the data, again, that we don't know who is doing the searching and exactly why. And because the more specific you make the search term, the less you get back. You often have to keep the terms relatively simple. So just to be clear, when you plug in the word bullying, I believe what it is returning for you is basically all the searches that involve the word bullying on its own. So that will include if I searched for school bullying, or why are my friends bullying me, or something like that. But it's a good question you ask. It is a disadvantage of this data that it's not that specific.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but now I'm beating up a lot of the data, but there are some good things about it. So the first good thing is it's publicly available, and you see it over a lot of time. It goes back all the way to 2004, I think, although I think the data is much better in recent years. You can play around with the search terms, you can play around with the geographies you're studying. But let me start to show you what I think we can conclude pre-COVID. So let me just spend a few slides, not about the pandemic, but just trying to convince you that the Google Trends search data contains real information about the prevalence of bullying. And so the first piece of evidence I'm going to show you that the search data itself seems related to actual bullying behavior is that it's very clear that there's pre-COVID, there's a very clear calendar pattern to search for bullying. And so this is just basically the raw data. I haven't adjusted it in any way other than taking a log and sort of picking 1 month as the baseline. But this shows you the intensity of search for the bullying or phrases that include bullying over time, pre-pandemic. And what you see is that search is very steady during the school year and then drops off very dramatically in summer months. That's not a pattern I would expect to be driven by things like workplace bullying, because people go to work in the summer. But school bullying, it makes sense that it might drop off in the summer when people are no longer in school. And so there's this very clear calendar pattern to the search data for bullying, as well as for cyberbullying, interestingly, right? And so even though the kids aren't in school anymore in the summer, in theory, they could be attacking each other online, but at least it seems like there's much less interest in this topic during the summertime, at least according to the internet search data. And so that's the sort of first piece of evidence, I think, that the search data may contain real indications of behaviors that are related to actual bullying. I'll just point out, these two graphs I've shown you are, as I said, it's basically plotting the raw search intensity data, the logarithm of it. We could also basically run some really simple regressions where we say, where we regress the search intensity on a bunch of dummies for which month of the year are we pulling the data from. And you can now see that pattern really distinctly where we sort of pulled away sort of all the noise. And I'm just showing you now the month dummies. And what it tells you is that the search for bullying and cyberbullying, I think this one is actually just the bullying, but it would work for cyberbullying as well. In September through May, when school is in session, search for these things is really steady. But in June, July, and August, in June and July, July is the 1 month where all schools in the US are really out. Depending on where you are in the country, some schools are still in session in June and others start their year again in August. But again, it's the minority of schools. And so in all these summer months, you see this pretty clear drop off in search for these terms. So we're going to take all of this as sort of evidence, at least that the calendar is suggesting that this search is related to something that's actually going on in schools. So that's the first piece of evidence that pre-COVID, it seems like the internet search data contains some real information about actual bullying behavior. But I'm going to give you, I think, an even stronger piece of information, which is, I think I mentioned before that the government agency, the CDC, does a survey of youth every year and it's a very large scale survey, thousands. I think by the time we aggregate it, it might even be upwards of 100,000 responses from high schoolers, where they're explicitly asked, have you been bullied or cyberbullied in the past year at school? And what we did here is to aggregate those responses by US state. So these are 50 data points, each one of which represents a different US state. And what we've graphed on the vertical axis is the fraction of students in that state who report being bullied. I can't remember if this is, I think this is just bullying, not cyberbullying. So this is just bullying. And you can already see from the spread in the vertical data that there's huge variation across US states in the extent to which students report being bullied. So some states, some close, upwards of 20% of students report being bullied. In other states, it's more like 13 or 14%. But here's what's really cool. We can then use the search data state by state to make measures of how much are people searching for bullying as a term in that state over this time period. And then we can see if there's a correlation between them. And the answer is there is a pretty clear correlation between them. I apologize, I didn't sort of include, there's like a basic sort of regression coefficient here, but it's a highly statistically significant relationship. And what that's telling us is that within the United States, states where search intensity for bullying is highest are also states where the actual fraction of students reporting being bullied is highest. And so again, it seems like there's this strong correlation in the pre-pandemic period between actual bullying behavior as reported by students and the search data itself.
Yes,
so we can take that as pretty exciting evidence.
May I ask a question? What's driving the heterogeneity, the state differences in bullying intensity?
That's a great question. Off the top of my head, I'm gonna give you two possible answers, and I'm open to both of them being wrong or there being other explanations. One is, I think, maybe like differences between Russia and the US, there may be differences in the extent to which people are willing to label something bullying versus not. It may be that in Texas, people have a different attitude about bullying and sort of whether they would call a certain behavior bullying when they answer this survey compared to Massachusetts, where I am. I think the other thing is that there's almost certainly big differences across states in the extent to which the state education systems or the local education systems take bullying seriously and take steps to actually combat it. So I know in Massachusetts, we devote a lot of resources to this. And I actually am ashamed to say I don't know which of these dots is Massachusetts, and I should know that. But I could imagine that there are very big differences across states in this regard. And so it may be that the low points here are states that are spending more resources actually trying to end bullying behaviors. But again, these are just hypotheses.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions about these sort of arguments from the calendar or from the survey data about why in the pre-pandemic period, it looks like the search data contains real information about real bullying? All right, if not, let me move on to now. Okay, so we've sort of taken the fact that in the pre-pandemic period, it seems like the internet search data contains real information about bullying. If we assume that relationship continues to hold in the post-pandemic period, then the search data suggests that bullying and cyberbullying really dropped dramatically during the pandemic. And so what I'm graphing for you here again is basically the raw search data, where the dashed line, the dashed vertical line in both of these graphs is the moment, it's March of 2020, basically the month in which, is it March 2020? Yeah, it's March 2020. It's the month in which US schools began to close. And by April, the dot after to the right of the dashed line, all schools in the US were closed. And what you can see in this raw data is that in the pre-pandemic period for both school bullying and cyberbullying, you see this very regular calendar pattern that I talked about before, where it's sort of steady during the school year, but drops off precipitously during the summer. And then when COVID hits and schools shut down, that pattern is broken in a way that has never happened before historically in the data. You can actually go farther back in time and it continues to look like that. And so this really seems like a sort of unprecedented moment. The level of search for this stuff drops way below historical norms. And so this is just the raw data version of that. And it's striking that it's true for both school bullying, and it's maybe a little bit less visible, but it's also true of cyberbullying as well. This is the raw data version of it. I'll just show you what happens when we sort of regression adjust it and basically remove those month fixed effects that we estimated from the sort of prior regressions I pointed out to you, so that we can sort of suck out the fact that like December is always a high month and July is always a low month. And we can do sort of an event study kind of graph. And this is what the sort of residuals look like, that when COVID hits, you see this historically unprecedented drop off in the intensity of search for both school and cyberbullying in the few months following that. But let me pause for a second and see. I didn't know if there were, I thought I might have seen a question, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I was wrong. Well, so what these graphs are showing you is that the sort of search intensity for school bullying and cyberbullying is relatively steady in the pre-pandemic period once you remove the sort of calendar, the typical calendar effects. But then in sort of April and May, it drops, and the extent of the drop, if you look, it's close to 0.5 log points. And so that's, really crudely, it's like a 50% drop off, but when logarithms get that big, you gotta adjust them further. So I think it's between something like a 30 and a 40% drop off. What you then see is in the summer months, bullying and cyberbullying search basically returns to pre-pandemic normal, because in the pre-pandemic, in summer months, basically no one's searching for this stuff. And that's basically what happens again. And then when school starts up again in sort of September or so, you again see the drop off relative to historical norms. And so in some sense, it feels like there are these sort of three periods post-pandemic. There's this sort of initial big drop. There's the summertime when things return to normal, and then schools open again, and there's a drop again. And so all of that again suggests that there's something, real going on here, which is to say that the drop off is really connected to the fact that schools being closed is unusual relative to historical norms. And in the summertime, everything looks sort of normal because there's never been any school. So let me pause there for a second and see if people sort of understand these event study graphs and what I'm claiming they show.
Sorry, I have a quick question in the in the second one, in the cyberbullying. So yeah, I can see in both you see a drop after COVID starts, but in the cyberbullying it seems to like catch.
Yeah.
There's drops again.
Yeah, there's a little bit of evidence. I completely agree with you. We didn't, we don't dwell on this too much in the paper, but there is at least a little evidence that in the summer of 2020. Search for cyberbullying was higher than it normally is in summertime. So it's always very low in summertime. So this is not to say that cyberbullying suddenly, shot up to crazy numbers, but it's saying relative to extremely low summertime behaviors,
I get.
It's higher than that. And it's an interesting question. I mean, couple of possibilities why this may be the case. First of all, it is true that students were spending a lot more time online that summer than they did in normal summers, and not in school. It's just that, lots of summer camps and other things were, eliminated. And so I know my kids spent a lot more time on computers in the summer of 2020 than they would have in any prior summer. And so presumably there were more opportunities for cyberbullying relative to previous summers where it was really low. So yeah, that is an interesting pattern. But the point is, I think the broader point is during the school year, at least, these things, both of these sets of bullying behaviors look much lower than historical norms,
certainly.
which is interesting. But yeah, it's a great point, Bernard.
And sorry, another question.
Yeah.
Do you have like any anecdotal evidence or at least ideas of like, for example, like you said summer 2020, like students spent more time online. Any idea of what sort of things they were looking for when they were Googling cyberbullying? Like any
That's a good
ideas?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think part of the challenge we have is we don't know who's doing the searching, right? We don't know if it's the students or the parents. Presumably it's not teachers at that point because kids weren't in school. But I don't know. It's a great question. I mean, my assumption, frankly, is that it's either kids or parents who are, being cyberbullied or watching their kid be cyberbullied and are just looking for resources about how to deal with that. But I don't know.
So can I quickly. So February 21 is just when you prepared your data, right? And you ran on all your regressions. There is no reason why you stopped at February 21 besides.
Yeah, right. We stopped there because we wrote this draft of the paper, and it was March when we downloaded the data, but you're absolutely right. As we are revising the paper, we need to do another download. We could bring it up to the present day. So yeah, when I gave a version of this talk a few months ago when it seemed more up to date, I apologize that it's
not a problem. It's just I'm thinking like they came back to schools, and some school I don't think they all came back to school.
I will show you data exactly on that question, because even in September of 2020 there were differences across schools in the US about which ones reopened and which ones didn't.
Right.
But you're absolutely right that by the end of the 2021 school year, by May or June, in almost all parts of the US, schools are reopened, not everywhere actually. And if we continue this data out, I am pretty sure we're going to see, and I'm sort of spoiling a couple of our results in a second, but I'm pretty sure we would see that things are slowly going to return back to historical normal levels. But I'm not positive of that. So we absolutely need to download the more recent data and keep this up to date.
No, but that could be arguably a natural experiment where you have a variation in treatment. I mean, you could have a story that Republican states are notoriously more bullying regions than non-Republican states, but it's just much less direct than,
And just to be clear, I'm going to show you some of that evidence based on the variation in which states were reopening in the fall, and your instincts are exactly right. And we're going to do it with sort of state fixed effects in there. So let me get to that, and I'll show you. Let's see. Do I care about regression results? Because I already showed you the graphs, which basically tell the whole story. But the way to quantify this when you put it into a regression framework is that in the post-COVID period across the whole of our data from March 2020 to February 21, which, as I said, we do have to update, on average, bullying search drops by about 30%, driven by a larger drop in the search for school bullying and a smaller drop, but still large drop in cyberbullying. And what's really interesting, again, and you saw this from the picture, so I don't know if the regression table in panel B here adds very much to this, but when we separate this into sort of spring 2020, summer 2020, and then the start of the new school year, you see in the regression coefficients exactly what you saw in that picture, which is that the drops in bullying search are all happening during actual school time, not during the summertime. And Bernardo, to your point, you can see in the rightmost column, in the summer post-COVID, there is one positive coefficient on cyberbullying there, that 0.189, which is exactly what you pointed out, which is at least relative to previous summers, there was a little more search for cyberbullying going on. But during the school years, search for all this stuff has dropped off by really large amounts. So maybe let me get now to the point that we were just talking about, which is, to what extent can we connect this drop off to school closures themselves? And what we're going to do that is use data. The US education system is extremely fragmented. And at the time that COVID started, the federal government was run by extraordinarily incompetent people who didn't even bother to
Can I interrupt you a bit?
Yeah, please, Bernardo.
Can you go back to the previous table?
Absolutely.
This is probably a very stupid question, but my understanding at the beginning was that you were looking in Google Trends for the concepts of bullying and cyberbullying.
Yes.
Then when you put here school bullying, you mean?
I apologize. I should have been much clearer about what these three columns are. So cyberbullying is very clear. It's what happens when we put the word cyberbullying into Google Trends. Okay. The column 2 that says school bullying is what we get when we just put the word bullying into Google Trends. Yeah. And then column 1 is the sum total of those two things.
Okay.
I absolutely should have been much clearer about that. And so bullying is sort of all of the behavior at once. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to separate it into the cyber piece and the piece where people are just searching for the word bullying. Now, by the way, the search for the word bullying itself might also include, variants of cyberbullying, but it actually turns out it looks sort of distinct in the data. And so we interpret that, we call that school bullying, which we're thinking of as like in-person physical, like I am with you, bullying you, as opposed to the online version. But we don't know for sure based on that search term. So I should have been much clearer. So yeah, so column 1 is, the outcome is always going to be the sum of column 2 and 3. And so it will always average out to whatever the average effect on those two terms is, roughly speaking.
Okay, thanks.
It's a great question. I should have been clearer. So if we had a competent national government in the US when COVID struck, we would have very quickly had a Department of Education that was collecting data on which schools were closing and which were opening, but we were not blessed with such a government. And so instead, we actually had to turn to sort of a private entity called Burbio. It's a private company that it's not worth even talking about, but basically that spent a lot of energy during the pandemic surveying schools and figuring out which schools are open, which schools are sort of in person, which schools are remote. And they made publicly available data on this at the county level, which is even finer than the state, but we average it up to the state in the US. It doesn't really matter how you do it, it turns out. But basically the idea is, we know that all schools in the US shut down in the spring of 2020, but in the fall of 2020, there was in fact a lot of variation about which schools reopened in person versus which schools remained remote. So in Massachusetts, where I am, the vast majority of schools remained remote. In the southern US, there was a lot more return to in-person instruction. And so what we're able to do is sort of connect the fall 2020 variation in whether schools reopen with the change in search intensity for bullying, excuse me. And what these graphs are showing, they're actually basically two versions of the same graph, just flipped left to right. What that top graph is showing is that in states where there are higher levels of remote virtual schooling in the fall of 2020, you tended to see lower search intensity in the fall for bullying and vice versa. So the higher the fraction of schools going to fully in-person instruction, the more you saw search intensity for bullying basically revert to historical norms. And so we take this as basically as evidence that, now again, it's not perfect evidence because other things might have been changing in these locations as well, but that there's a pretty clear connection between the return to in-person schooling and the slow return of bullying search to its pre-pandemic historical norms. So that's the graph version of this. And I guess here's the regression. I never know whether the regression tables add anything to this, but the idea is here that as I said, that bullying reverts closer to the pre-pandemic levels in states where a larger fraction of schools went in person. And so what our estimates imply is that if in this past school year, the 2020 to 2021 school year, if no schools had offered in-person instruction, meaning everyone had stayed remote, bullying would have dropped by something like 50%. Actually, I think that's not quite right, because I think negative 55 log points is actually not quite 50%, but it would have dropped by a lot. And conversely, if all schools had offered in-person instruction, actually we can make a prediction about this, and it looks like bullying search would still have dropped, which is interesting, given our estimates, but only by 20%. And so it does seem like the in-person instruction is deeply tied to the extent to which bullying disappears or not. I don't know. I never know whether this slide is actually clarifying. Let me pause here and see if there are questions. But broadly, this was our attempt to try to figure out, you could imagine that COVID sort of changes the extent of bullying for all kinds of reasons that don't have to do with school per se, right? It was a massive disruption to people's economic lives, to their social lives outside of school. But this is sort of our attempt to say this really is something about school itself. All right. Well, let me wrap up with one sort of summary of, I think, what our argument is, and then I'll sort of have another slide on what I think this what kind of thoughts this maybe should provoke in us. So just to wrap up, what did we find? We found that online search data for bullying has both temporal and spatial patterns, suggesting it's a good proxy for actual bullying, at least in the pre-pandemic period. That same search data shows that school-based bullying and cyberbullying both declined a lot during the pandemic, and that there seems to be evidence that school reopenings are sending such patterns back toward pre-pandemic normal, although maybe not all the way back yet. It's a particularly striking fact that cyberbullying does not substitute for school bullying. That was in some sense, the prediction that a lot of people were making when schools went fully remote, or at least a prediction that people were making. And so I think there's an interesting set of questions this raises. On the one hand, it's great that bullying disappeared, or at least dropped off dramatically. On the other hand, it's not like it's a great policy prescription to say, let's have a pandemic so we can get rid of, or let's cancel school so we can get rid of bullying. And so I think it's worth saying, we should think a little bit about why the pandemic and the move to virtual instruction disrupted bullying. One really obvious reason is that there was just much less contact overall between peers. So there were sort of, fewer moments to sort of trigger bullying episodes. It's also true that in virtual instruction, at least, students are, if anything, more closely observed by their teachers than in a regular classroom where lots of things are going on. I can see what's going on in my Zoom class. I can see everyone as long as their cameras are on. The other thing that's interesting to think about is that even when schools returned in person, I know from my kids are all in elementary school during this time, and when they did return to in-person school after a full year of not having any in-person schooling, the school day was very different from the one they had previously experienced. There were a lot fewer unstructured moments. The schools were designed in a way, the new school days were designed in a way that kids were no longer mixing in large groups. And so the number of kids I interacted with becomes a lot smaller. There's a lot less sort of movement in the hallways, a lot less socializing at lunchtime and outside of the building. And so in general, there's just the time is much more structured and monitored. And so these sort of moments in schools where these incidents tend to happen, sort of a lot of them were just eliminated by the structure of the new school day. And so I think the big question going forward is sort of is there anything positive we can learn from this in order to keep bullying rates going, lower when the world has returned to normal? And I'm not sure the answer is yes. I do think there's sort of hints of stuff that we might take away that's suggestive. But to me, that's the sort of open question that I'd love other people to think about. So that's it. That's all I've got. And I'm happy to just have a discussion about these results, about other ways one might use Google Trends, search data, anything you want.
So in terms of substitution or non-substitution between, physical bullying and cyberbullying, I think it's the supply story, right? Like people who dole out physical bullying are not the same people who are, going online and make jokes. They have different comparative advantages, if you know what I mean.
That's interesting. So I'll tell you, my co-authors, Jen and Melissa, who are much more expert in this stuff than I am, they had, if anything, the opposite interpretation of this, which is their interpretation of the drop in cyberbullying was there's at least some evidence from survey data that the people who do cyberbullying are the same people who do in-school bullying. And in fact, that a lot of the cyberbullying has its origins in sort of physical interactions that go badly and then sort of move online. And so their interpretation of the data was when you remove all of those triggering incidents in person, it sort of removes
there is no reason for
a
us
lot of cyberbullying.
Very interesting.
It's a great, it's a really interesting question. Yeah. Bernardo.
Yes, I'm still trying to formulate the question in my mind. Yes, well, this is a question about the data itself, and maybe because I didn't fully understand the search intensity concept.
Yeah.
So I understand that, you don't see the actual volume of search.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like, let's suppose that on a given period, you have like let's say like 100 searches of bullying, and then like 100 searches of other topics, just for the sake of it. And then in another period, you have again 100 searches of bullying and then 1,000 of other topics. Like, does it mean that the intensity goes down even though like the volume was kind of the same?
It does. So that's right. So the intensity has a numerator and a denominator, and implicitly we are assuming in this analysis that the denominator is not changing, or at least not changing very much. We have some evidence that that's true. So Google hides it's remarkably difficult to uncover data about something as simple as how many Google searches have there been in an area in a given time period in total. But there are some like private firms that try to estimate this based on various internet traffic that they monitor. And so we uncovered at least a little bit of this stuff that suggested that actually the volume of sort of Google searches over this period is remarkably stable. Like there's nothing, it's not like suddenly people are searching twice as much for stuff on Google. They are at home watching a lot more Netflix, but that doesn't, it turns out that doesn't, change their internet search behavior too much. But it's a good question. I wish we had even better data to help comfort us on that fact, because you're absolutely right. The search intensity it's a fraction. And so we're sort of depending on that, the numerator being the only thing that's moving. We can't pin that down with 100% certainty.
Yeah, I have another question. Again, I don't have it fully formulated, so I just formulated on the go. Basically here, schools, or at least many children spend like a whole year outside. I mean, without in-person. I'm wondering whether there are some events before the pandemic that may have shut down schools in a state or a region for a shorter period, and if you see that, well, it comes to my mind that the first paper I saw about you, which is at least the version I have is a working paper about student absences on snow days from
yes. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. So right. So you're saying it would be neat to maybe find other things that shut down schools that might change bullying search. Yeah, so snow days would be one such thing. I'm a little skeptical you could use that only because
I don't think that, but some other events
it's fantastic. What I don't know is whether I'd have to think about what other events might do that.
Or I don't know, like a hurricane.
So hurricanes or wildfires would be sort of the two things that could shut down schools for extended periods of time. The only other challenge I think you'd have, and a hurricane might actually take care of this challenge, is that even in the US, the finest level of geography you can go to with the Google search data is something only somewhat smaller than a state. It's, you can do certain cities, but so you need to be able to detect something at the level of roughly a state in the US. And so, a snow day that shuts down my kid's school isn't going to show up in the data unless it shuts down, all of Massachusetts, which it might. But I really like that idea of potentially looking for other kinds of moments in time that shut down schools to test this. Yeah, let me think a little more about that.
I mean, I'm thinking that it would be nice to, I don't know if it's feasible, probably not, but to see, okay, if we shut down schools for 1 year, then we see this effect, but I'm wondering whether a shorter closure would have something similar.
No, it's a fantastic question. I mean, I'll say a couple of things. So one is that at least in this data, we see the drop off in the bullying search immediately when the schools shut down. It's not like it takes a year to drop off. The other thing I'll say, and this is just sort of a general point about using this data, is in this paper, we use sort of the monthly data because we didn't need anything more fine-grained. I know from Google Trends, you can actually get weekly search data. And I even think you can maybe get daily search data as well. The problem is that the finer the unit of geography or time you use, the more likely Google's going to spit back some kind of zero because they basically bottom code if there's too little search going on, they're going to disguise it for whatever they think are sort of confidentiality reasons.
Oh, okay.
But in theory, you might be able to do an even finer look at, you know, this school closed in this week, or this state, you know, had a hurricane this week, as opposed to, you know, having to be closed for a whole month at a time. So it is possible to do other stuff with this data. I mean, the real thing that I would love, and I tried working my connections to do this, but really what I'd love is to like work with someone at Google who has the raw data itself. Shockingly, it turns out to be hard to convince people there to do that kind of work. Well, but I worked every connection I had. I knew a doctoral student from another university that had finished his degree and ended up working at Google, and I begged him and it didn't work out.
Maybe there were not enough zeros in the begging email.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that could be. In fairness, he thought he might get fired if he let me use the data for this. So, you know.
And I totally understand.
Yeah. But I do feel like a lot of my career has been spent, particularly when you work in education, and you end up almost always having to partner with schools or some organization that actually holds the data itself. I feel like a large fraction of my life is all about working social networks and connections to try to find people who can turn over interesting data to me. So, but this is a good example of a paper where, like, you know, I loved it because it was all sort of publicly available. We had to do a bunch of, you know, cleaning and sort of tricking of Google's interface to get the data, but it was nice not to have to get permission from anyone to use it.
Yeah, well, that's a good achievement.
Yeah. I'm happy to stop screen sharing here and just like talk to people.
So does anyone else have any other questions, comments, suggestions? Okay, so it seems that that's it for today. Well, thanks very much, Josh, for joining us. Like, I think we really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was a pleasure.
I don't have children myself, but still was interesting to see. And I know that people do have children here.
I highly recommend not having children during a pandemic. So you did it right.
Yeah, well, I think that's the case, at least from what I've seen from friends. So. And well, so in 2 weeks, we have our next seminar, the 21st of October. We will have Andrei Markevich from New Economic School, and he will be presenting his paper on the political economic causes of the Soviet Great Famine from 1932 and 33. So 2 weeks time, same place, same time. So well, thanks once more, Josh, for presenting. Thanks our people who attended, and yeah, have a good evening and a good day, you. Good week, everyone.
I really appreciate it, Bernard. Thank you, and thanks, Victoria, for hosting me.
So thank you too for very interesting research. It was exciting.
Great, my pleasure. I appreciate it. All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.